Everyone, I'm Mark Weitzel. As introduced, I'm a principal architect at Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft for about 18 months now, and I'm joined remotely from Austin, Texas by my colleague Mike. And one of the things, I've done a number of things at Microsoft. I worked on our developer CLI, which is out now in public preview. I'm working on a project called Cattle, which Brian Turleson will be here, and I think he's here now, and he's got a session on that tomorrow, and Mike will talk about that. But one of the things, and the reason I'm here now, is to talk about the work I'm doing on our API Stewardship Board and how we really work across all of our Azure surface area and our Azure teams to help build better APIs. So a couple of things that we'll talk about today, and I put this intentionally as a discussion. This is something that we want to start with everybody here in the community of how we can help people build APIs better. This is foundationally what we're trying to do inside of Azure with our teams and with the people that we work with. And there's a lot of nuance in building APIs. This crowd knows that for certain. And so how can we help our teams do that better? So we'll talk about why we focus on APIs, why they're so critical to us at Microsoft. And then we'll look at some of the things that happen when you scale out. And these are challenges that, big companies, it must be because you're big. I actually think that these challenges hit companies of all sizes as you just start to grow. And then we'll talk about our stewardship model. There's this big discussion of stewardship, governance, what do you do? This is the model that's working for us right now. And there's some rough edges which we'll talk about as well. And those are the lessons learned. So why do we focus on APIs? I think APIs are what's driving the economy, right? It's an engine for growth. It's certainly the engine for growth of what we see at Microsoft. If you look at the stock performance of many of the companies there, those are really well-known companies. We got Dreamforce in town, so I guess nobody's going into the city to eat anywhere. But this isn't the kind of growth you get as you start to think about how can I expose or let people use the services that I'm creating, the capability that I'm bringing to market in new and interesting ways. And so for us, that's what we think about. How do we help developers use Azure in new and interesting ways? And this is a recent tweet by the head of research at Gartner. And there's a lot of really interesting things on here that really come as no surprise to us in the API world and people who work and build and deal and ship APIs all the time. You can see that the growth is just going to continue externally, but the one that I think is really interesting here is that the 98% of orgs plan to use APIs internally as well, right? And so if we think about where we started many years ago, this was about declaring what we do externally, right? How external people can be using our services. But really, we have to start thinking about how does that change when things happen internally as well, when more and more people are consuming or setting themselves up as internal SaaS companies within their own organization. How does that change what we're thinking about? Things like Backstage and developer portals, where do we play in that space? And I think all of that's really interesting from us as an API community. And really, as we think about this, this is I don't have Odyssey or Odyssey slides, so forgive me here, but APIs are the center of what's driving all of this. But really, things start to ripple out. At Azure, we produce SDKs in 5 languages. We have mobile SDKs. We give those to our customers, who give them to their customers, who give them to and it's turtles all the way down, right? And so we think very carefully about how do these things change over time? What's the life cycle of these things? Where are things going to break if we don't do it right? The way things get represented in typed languages versus non-typed languages and how they get expressed in your API definition. All of these decisions matter. And as we've talked with our customers who are looking at this saying, how do we start forming our API practice internally? Because we're starting to use more and more of our own APIs internally and starting to develop this API practice, how do we make it easy for our customers, internal, external, to start delivering APIs and to start, do we provide SDKs? Well, what languages do we, and all of these same things that that we deal with, now we're starting to see happening at scale. And for us, scale is a problem. I mean, if we think about the number of services that Azure has, it's well over 100 now. Each of those services has really their own unique set of patterns that they have, right? You know, we do all of these things over REST, or a lot of them over REST. But I mean, think about it. We have IoT, we have cognitive, we have maps, we have storage, right? The way that these APIs work are fundamentally different. And so we have to think about how do we not only handle the growing surface area of these services, but just the vast diversity of things that we're dealing with. And you know, as the services grow, both in terms of the number of services, but also the services themselves grow, right? You know, if we think of cognitive services as an example with speech, and now we have language and vision, and now we partnered with the Open API folks. So like these things are growing this way, but that means our teams are growing as well. And when the teams grow, that leads to lots of interesting problems, like information spreads across the company, often geographically dispersed. And so we have teams, you know, that might work on a particular area of cognitive or maps or something like that, that are in different geographic regions. And the API surface area gets really, really big. And sometimes what we end up doing is having to consolidate a number of smaller API documents into a larger one. And so what that essentially means is that it becomes more and more difficult to get the complete view of what you're looking at from a service perspective. And that's one of the challenges that we're dealing with. The other thing that we do is we constantly learn from our service team, from the industry, like how we should be doing REST, you know, how we should be improving some of the things that we do. But we have to keep our APIs stable. So there's this tension that gets introduced that as you scale, as you grow, as your service evolves, as what you learn about how you want to deliver changes, and how you want your REST APIs to work, there's this tension there. And one of the things is, an example of what you see there is the guidelines for adding Azure deprecating at the bottom. This was, again, from one of our cognitive services team, and they're not deprecating their API. What they're deprecating is the way their models get trained, and they had no way to communicate that throughout, you know, to their customers that are using it. Like, hey, the way you train this model, that goes away. And so we talked with them about it. Their initial idea was like, oh, we'll just throw this in the response body. And we're like, oh, that may not be the best thing. And so we came up with this notion of putting it in the header, and then realized that, oh, we could make this a generic approach across the Azure surface area. And then we could inform our customers and consumers, like, start doing log monitoring for this header. So if something comes in, you know you have an action to take. So how we do REST, how we communicate, how we want our surface area to evolve, that also has to happen. But we have a very hard focus on avoiding breaking changes. And our policy is that if an API is GA, it's 3 years that you have to support it as a service team. 3 years. So I talked about this tension, right? Our service teams want to move fast. Just leave me alone. Let's go. We're running as fast as we can. We got to get it out. We got to get new service. We got to add capability. But you know, we have guidelines. We have a set of standards that we expect our service teams to do to make our service consistent across that surface area. And so there's this natural tension of what we really want is an open road where we can just drive down as fast as we can and deliver everything as fast as we can, and at the same time, no breaking changes. Do things the way that our guidelines say that they are. So there's this natural gate that we put up in place, so that we feel like we want to, like, oh, you can't release your API until you do this. In fact, that's where we started many years ago before I joined Microsoft, is that we had this review board. And like all your APIs had to be reviewed before they went out. And what we found is that just introduced a lot of friction, and that just slowed everything down, and everybody was really unsatisfied with the way that was working. And so teams naturally like found ways around that. Well, I'm releasing in 2 weeks. Just give me the checkbox. We got to go. And it's like, well, you're going to break, right? You know, you're doing a post. It's not idempotent. You're going to get support. Yeah. So all of those sorts of things, like that's the tension that we had. And so we developed this idea of, no, what we really want you to do is engage us early in the process and think about this as a roundabout. Go as fast as you want, but every once in a while, you're going to slow down. You're going to curve and you're going to merge into traffic. You're going to see an off-ramp if you need it. And so we'll talk about some of those off-ramps, and we'll talk about that. That practice is what we call our API stewardship. So it's not a governance, it's not a gate, it's not those things. It's how you help a team, how you partner with a team, how you work with them as early as possible in their API design process to think about the issues that they're going to hit down the road to make their API stable, durable, and usable. So this is a broad set of folks from across the company, but it's not large. And it's not like we hired a massive team to go do this. This is all volunteers to go off and work with our teams to build better APIs, to really partner with them. And we have folks from across Microsoft. We have Microsoft CTO, we have the Azure CTO, we have folks that are in my team that build the SDKs, that build and ship and deliver the SDKs. But we also have field teams. So we went out and asked our customer success engineers, the people who work, sometimes do code with or code for engagements with our customers, to partner with us and come in and help us early in the cycle, help design the APIs of the service teams. So you have direct field input shaping how the product works. And that turns out to be very powerful. We try to do this globally across, we're a very diverse and global company. And so this has had two effects. One, we want local representation, so folks in Shanghai have somebody they can go talk to about APIs there. But also, we've come across like oddities in language, like, that seems like an odd word to be using. What are you trying to say there? And so those little points ended up being very interesting. But what I'm most excited about is that we're open. We're open and inclusive for anyone. And so our job is to build, help foster and create this notion of building APIs. And this is my hammer effect, right? I can put a hammer in front of any one of you, and you're just going to know how to use it. You're going to pick it up, feel it in your hand, feel the weight of it, and start banging things, right? Because that's how hammers are designed. And that's exactly what I want our APIs to be. Intuitive, you know what they are when you look at them, and you can start using them right away. We do this with 3 pillars: educate, enable, and empower. The first part about education is understanding where, telling the teams exactly what they need to do. This notion that clarity is kindness. So if you're starting an API practice, you're like, where do I begin? Start here. Write your guidelines down. Write your style guide down. And define what the heck a breaking change is so your teams know not what to do and you know what to look for. And then give other supporting content. We have this notion of considerations for service design, which goes into why things are designed the way they are, why our LRO pattern works the way it is. And we have a set of videos that explain REST and a little bit about how we do Azure. And what we're trying to get to our service teams is that design is intentional. And we see a lot of times, things that happen. We write the code first, out pops an API from, some API generator. And we also see a common thing of, well, what I'm trying to do is develop this UI for the portal, so here's what this is. And you can see this in the API specifications that come out. Somebody returns an object type. It's like, well, what is that doing? How are you going to code against that if you're a developer? So one of the first questions we ask a team as we start to partner with them is, what are your hero scenarios? What are you doing? And so good APIs are intentional. And those are supported by some tooling. And this is where I'll turn it over to Mike to talk about tooling.
Thanks, Mark.
This is where I'll turn
so
it over
what
to
you
Mike
see here is
to talk about tooling.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. So what you see here is a bird's eye view of the tooling that we've built around our REST API definitions. The definition is over there on the left. It's Open API. We have these published in a GitHub repo. Anybody can look at those. And then we have an extensive set of tooling that runs on every PR check-in that takes that API definition, runs through a set of linters, checks for breaking changes. And then downstream from that, we have a bunch of generators that produce client libraries and test artifacts and command lines and bicep and mobile SDKs and all those things. Those things are wrapped in a collaboration layer that we use Teams for. And we use GitHub for all of our source control and issue tracking. And this works pretty well, But the one problem that we have with this is that a lot of that work happens downstream from what the developer is doing, right? The linting happens in the PR pipeline rather than as the API designer is actually building their API definition. So next slide. So we've started to rely on tools that the developer can actually use in their own environment. And one of the tools that we're starting to use heavily is the Spectral linter from Stoplight. It lets you build custom rules that enforce your set of API guidelines. And we've built a whole suite of custom rules to enforce the Azure API guidelines and the Azure style guide. These are things that developers can use either from the command line or within an IDE like VS Code. You can see shown here. We have linter rules for most of our guidelines. And some of these rules are sort of info or warning rules that help guide the design review meetings, help us spot the areas where we really want to poke and ask the service team, do you know what you're doing here? Are these the right things? It might not require a change, but this lets us make sure that we cover those things when we're doing the design review. We're also building some tooling that will test the service implementation and make sure it conforms to its own API definition as well as our API guidelines. And between those two things, we're going to cover about 2/3 of our guidelines through this automated tooling, which leaves the other third to be the stuff that's covered in the API design reviews. Next slide. And then the last thing that we're doing is we're building a new design language for APIs that we call CATL. Now, this is a true language, much like TypeScript or C# that's compiled, and it lets you write your API design in sort of a very natural way for developers, and in a very concise way, but then it can produce OpenAPI, standard OpenAPI 3 from that API design. The CATL is much more concise, and it relies on libraries. And in those libraries, you can build in all of your API patterns so that the generated API definition conforms to those patterns automatically. And we've built those libraries for Azure so that when an API designer uses our libraries, they will get an API definition that's correct by construction, that follows all of our best patterns just by using the library, which actually is a more pleasant experience for the API designer anyway. CATL comes with a set of design tools that build into VS Code so that you get things like syntax highlighting and code navigation, so that it's a very productive environment for API designers. Another thing is that we've built in versioning right into CATL so that you can evolve your API design in a very orderly way and produce multiple versions of your API definition from a single CATL document. Brian Turlson will be giving a talk tomorrow on CATL at 10:45. It's going to be a great talk. I hope you check it out. And now I'll turn it back to Mark to talk about how we empower API designers with API design reviews.
Thanks, Mike. The one other thing about CATL is it is in open source right now, so it's not just Microsoft proprietary, but it's an open source project that we have. So thinking about empowerment, this is one of the third pillar of our stewardship model, and probably the most important tool that we have right here is this notion of our API design review. And we've done code reviews for ages, and now we're thinking about what's the right way to do an API design review with our service partners as we're working with them to build out that review or that API. And so one of the things that we found is, let's start with understanding what they're trying to do, have them describe to us what their hero scenarios are. And this allows us to focus on the areas of the biggest customer impact that we have. And then from there, what typically happens is we start to identify lots of common pitfalls that we see. And these are things like fault tolerance. We talked about, post versus put and things like that. Well, this is one of the areas that we see. We talked about version resiliency, things that are going to, sort of break you over time as your API wants to evolve in the way that it wants to evolve. Collections is another area that we see a lot of work that we go into. The example that's right there is this notion of returning something simple like a next link, because for us, if you don't declare your API as pageable, that's a breaking change if you later realize, like, oops, I've got to now return a paged set of results. That's a breaking change for us because that affects everything that we do downstream, code generation, et cetera. And so if you go out in GA without a next link, well, there you go. That's 3 years you're going to live with that thing. And then also what's the developer going to be doing? Are you going to be giving them a collection? Are they going to take something out of that collection? Are they going to manipulate it and put it back? Well, if you do that, you need e-tags, right? You need a way to do that optimistic concurrency. And so those things, I think, are the common pitfalls. And we can lint for a lot of those things. And many of those fall in that 2/3 bucket that Mike talked about in our tool chain. But what we try to do is get those things out of the way. We try to get rid of those common pitfalls, because what we really want to talk about these important but sometimes very subtle design decisions. One example that we're talking with now with our maps team is what's the content type that you should return? And they're talking about, well, our use cases say GeoJSON. It's like, okay, that's great, but what if that needs to change, right? Well, that's a breaking change for us. And so we're having this discussion of, do you think over time, maybe not this release or the one after, do you think that will change where you'll have to add additional metadata to that response? And so we're having those discussions. And in these API design reviews, what we found is if you bring a bunch of engineers, they sort of get it and they nod their heads. But this is a business conversation. This is how you're going to serve your customers. So when you're going into the design reviews, you can't have just the technical folks there. You need your PM leadership there as well. And so you need to have the PMs there because they can go back and say, oh, maybe that's a different user study that we need to do, or I need to go ask a different set of constituents of who's using this service. And so this has been one of the most powerful tools that we've had, and we're improving how we do this, but getting to the teams early, in their design cycle as they're thinking about their service. This is something that has proven very valuable for us. The other thing that's proven very valuable is 3 words: read your docs. And it sounds silly, right? But one of the things that's in that tool chain is automatic documentation generation. And we spew out our developer docs right from the Open API specification. And so we give teams the ability to preview their documentation. And when they see it, it's very interesting, the result. Because sometimes we ask questions like, can you read what this thing does, by looking at the description? And so what we're really trying to do is get them to think about what the first experience that a developer is going to have when they come to their service, right? Put somebody else's shoes on and try to understand your API and, kind of get out of yourself for a little bit, because you know these things, you built these things, you understand them deeply. And so trying to look at this from another perspective is very helpful. And also understanding the relationship of what you define in the Open API specification to what the developer actually sees is another nice thread that we tie together there. So reading the documentation is very, very important. The other thing that we're trying to do, and I don't have a nice, I should have put something from the Odyssey up here, or maybe the Iliad, is this notion of previewing the APIs, right? This notion of learn from your customers. And we're getting better at this. This is an area that we're starting to focus on because we're seeing good value points along the way. But things like defining clear objectives for your APIs. And so when we talk with services, we work with services and say, great, we're going preview. It's like, well, what do you want to learn about your API? It's like, well, we think about, does the service work? Does the portal work that people interact with? It's like, okay, well, how are developers going to be using this? How are they going to be coding against it? What's the SDK experience like? What are the number of calls you're going to be making against that API? What can you learn there? So we're starting to be much more thoughtful about putting a plan around the API when they go preview. And I mentioned earlier that the Stewardship Board has a set of folks from our customer success organization, our field team. They've been valuable in trying to understand and how to define this a little bit better. The other thing is to set expectations with customers that these things are going to change, right? We're going to evolve and we're going to learn. And if you can partner with some early adopters, that helps as well. So there's been a lot of things that we've done, I think, over the last 18 months or so to really improve how we're thinking about APIs, how we're growing this stewardship effort. And here are some sort of lessons learned, and some of them have been painful along the way. The first one is, our APIs don't stop at the specification. Our APIs, they cover the whole life cycle of a developer experience. So you start with thinking, what was the picture we had before, that beautiful garden along the way. And it's like, wow, that's really pretty. And then well, you got to write some SDKs on top of it. It's like, I got a couple of weeds over here, and I got to, and now my customer's using it, and I got to fix it. I got some breaking changes over here, and it's like, so it's like that whole life cycle that we have. APIs don't stop at the specification, and it's really this entire life cycle that we need to be thinking about, and how our API definitions and our specifications play into that. The other thing is when we started, we had the Stewardship Board, and we'd look around and say, hey, Mike, you think we're awesome? And Mike would say, yeah, I think we're awesome. And then we'd ask the other people, you think we're awesome? And like, yeah, you think we're doing a good job? Yeah. But we really didn't ask the people who we were serving very well. And so we actually asked them a simple survey, like, would you work with the API Stewardship Board? Are we bringing value to what you do? And we did a very simple NPS score. We built a feedback loop so that we could constantly improve and understand where we need to go off and improve. And we dug into, what's getting better. And I'm actually pretty impressed by some of the things that as a group of volunteers we're able to do across such a large surface area. Improving the design, improving the usability, consistency, and that last one, which is probably one of the most expensive one, avoiding breaking changes, talking up front about the things that you're going to do that are going to bite you later. And that feedback has been very candid. We have an open, hey, what could we do better kind of question. And you can see that when we started a little while ago, we had the feedback you have a lot of really smart people who really know APIs, but not a lot of them are building services. And not a lot of them are walking in my shoes. So we went out and found people that are walking their shoes, and we have representation now. And so there's a lot of things that we're looking at to constantly improve this cycle, and that goes back to the initial slide that we were talking about before. This is a journey. We're still plotting our course. We're still figuring things out. That's why I'm excited to be talking with all of you today, because I suspect a lot of you are dealing with some of these same issues. And so it's our hope to start this discussion so that we can all get better and that we can all improve and make APIs better for everybody and drive the API economy. Thank you very much.